Okay, good morning. Okay, good morning. Baruch Shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lezman hazeh. It's very exciting. We're starting a new Masechta, Masechtas Eruvin. Okay, I think people are very intimidated by Eruvin, but I don't think we need to be so intimidated. I think, especially after doing Shabbos, even if you didn't, there's a lot of good stuff here, and I think, piece by piece, idea by idea, we'll get through it. So, let's jump in. We don't have the Lego set yet, but we will have a Lego set, God willing, at some point. So here we go. So the Mishnah begins by talking about a mavoi. A mavoi is a entrance where you have an alleyway. Okay, so basically you have the way cities work, the way that cities were constructed. Everyone had a courtyard, and you normally had a couple of houses in a courtyard typically, and then each of the courtyards would open up into an alleyway, what we'll call like a street, basically opening into a street. So you have a street, and you have a courtyard, and the courtyards all open up into the alleyway, and then this alleyway or street will open up into a main road, okay, into a Rosh Hashanah. Now there's a concern over here. The alleyway is a private domain. The alleyway is not a public domain. The public domain is a public domain. The problem is you have your street that goes into the public domain, and there's a concern that one street, two streets, they're all the same. Why would a person recognize that one is distinct from the next? And there's a concern that a person will go ahead and will think that they are in a private domain, just like while they're in the mavui, in the alleyway, and they're allowed to carry there because it's a private domain. Maybe a person will go ahead and carry from the private domain into the public domain, right? And they will not realize that there is a distinction between the two because both of them are streets. Just one is a Rosh Hashanah and one is a full-fledged public domain, which it is absolutely forbidden to carry there. But the problem is that there's nothing really stopping you from going from this private domain, the mavui, the alleyway, into the public domain. And therefore, right, you understand the concern over here? In other words, let's say you have, you go from Shelleydale, let's just say Green Spring was a Rosh Hashanah. Let's say it was wide enough and had enough traffic that it was a Rosh Hashanah, and you have Shelleydale, which is not. Okay, that would more or less be the parallel. And the concern is, persons going down Shelleydale, why would they think that anything's any different when they get to Greenspring? And therefore, they may just continue, while they're carrying on Shelleydale, they may just go ahead and continue walking and walk onto Greenspring carrying the stuff that they're carrying. That's a problem. That's going to be an issue. And so therefore, the rabbis came up with an idea to remind people that there is a distinction, and they created two tools, okay? One is going to be a tool that's going to be on the side of the doorway of the entranceway that is leaving the mavoi. In other words, if you're leaving this alleyway, there's typically going to be walls on the side. If you're going to go ahead, if you have some reminder on that wall, on the side of the wall, that's going to be one thing, which we're not talking about just yet. The other thing is a beam across. A beam across, which serves as a reminder, okay, that a lechi, which is a beam across, which reminds a person, oh, I'm now leaving. It's just a reminder. It's just something there. A reminder, oh, this is now different. The space where I am right now is different than the public domain, okay? So you need to have this beam across. That's called a lechi. So far, so good, right? So the Gemara is saying that the mavoi, this lechi, which is a korah, I mixed up the terms. A korah is the beam across. If the korah is this korah, which is placed across the entranceway of the mavoi, shugavola l'malam esr mam, if it's higher than 20 amos, okay, if it's higher than 20 amos, you have to lower it. That's too high. Okay, we'll see what the source of this is soon, but if it's higher than 20 amos, it's too high, and therefore you have to lower it in order for it to be a valid reminder. In order for it to be a valid korah, it can't be too high. So if it's higher than 20 amos, you'd have to lower it. That's the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eino Tzorach. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it's valid even if it's higher than 20 amos. Okay? So you have a machlokas. What happens if you have a lechi, a korah, that it's higher than 20 amos? The Tanna Kama says that it is too high, and you have to lower it to under 20 amos. And Yehuda says, no, it is not too high. You're allowed to leave it there. We'll see what the source of their machlokas is shortly. Okay, now we focus on the width. Let's say the entranceway to the mavoi is wider than 10 amos. You have to decrease the distance, the width. Okay, if it's too wide, then again, what's the issue over here? The issue is that it's too continuous. I'm going from Shelleydale, from my alleyway, into Greenspring, and I don't really see them as distinct. So if it's wider than 10 amos, you have another issue. It's just too continuous. You don't really see that there's any stoppage. There's nothing, even if I have the crossbeam. If it's too wide, then there's nothing really reminding me, right? And therefore, if it's too wide, the Mishnah says, then you have to make it less wide than 10 amos, because wider than 10 amos, it's just too wide, and I'm not going to realize it's a distinct space. However, if it has a full-fledged doorway, what is a doorway? A doorway has two distinct posts and a top as well. Okay, Tzuras HaPesach is a concept we find it in many places, like by a mezuzah, let's say. Let's say you'll have in a door where in order for something to be necessitated a mezuzah, you need to have two distinct doorposts and a top as well, right? So if you have something with that shows like it's a door, and even if it's wider than 10 amos, it's like, oh, this is a door. There's something distinct that's sticking out on all sides. Then already becomes a full-fledged doorway, and that would be enough to remind you, oh, this is no longer Shellydale, it's now Greenspring, right? Even if it's wider than 10 amos, you don't have to decrease the width, because that reminds you, that shows you it's a door, and therefore there's no concern that you're going to go from Shellydale into Greenspring. Okay, so basically two halachos. One is a machlokes. The first thing is machlokes. What we're talking about is a reminder. We go from a quasi-private domain, this alleyway, what we'll call sort of like Shellydale, basically an alleyway, a private street, sort of private street that goes from a private street that goes into Rosh Hashanah. We have to have a reminder, because there's a concern a person's not going to realize the distinction, and therefore you need to have a cross bimataf, what is called a korah. Tanakama says if it's higher than 10 amos, it's a problem. If it's lower than 10 amos, it's okay. Rabbi Yehuda says that's not a problem. If it's higher than 10 amos, that's still okay. We'll see what they're actually arguing about. We'll get back to. And then we have this point that is agreed upon by everyone, that this entranceway can't be too wide. If it's too wide, you don't have a reminder. It has to be narrow, unless there's an actual doorway. If it's an actual doorway, then that is enough of a distinct, oh, this is something different. Shellydale, the alleyway, the mavoi is different than the public domain. That already is okay. Okay? All of this is built around, the whole Eruvin, by the way, which is going to come up in a lot of the Gaddots as well, is all revolving around rabbinic law over here. In other words, biblically, you have a public domain, you have a private domain. What this whole Masechta is built around, what really revolves around, is basically, on the one hand, a concern, different safeguards to ensure that we don't violate biblical prohibitions, and we see that the length that the rabbis have to go. At the same time, it's balanced by an allowance, an assurance, trying to say, okay, we want to make sure you don't violate a biblical prohibition, but we also don't want to make your life crazy, right? So it's like this balancing act between the both of them, right? Meaning even the whole concept of an Eruv, like there's this, what's his name? There's like this famous late night show which had this whole thing like mocking Eruvin, like an Eruv, like basically had like a hat which had like an Eruv around the hat. He's like, oh, I could, and he's like eating a cheeseburger. He's like, I could eat treif. I have an Eruv. Who is it? John Stewart? I don't know. Whatever. Whatever. And the point is, right, he's saying like an Eruv, like I can do whatever I want. The point is, no. There are biblical prohibitions which this whole Gemara is not talking about. In other words, the biblical prohibitions are there. The rabbis came along and created rabbinic restrictions to prevent us from violating biblical restrictions, and then within those rabbinic restrictions, they also built in some allowances, right? So meaning even an Eruv, the whole concept of Eruv is because we're not even talking about a real full-fledged biblical public domain, right? So, right, just to appreciate like what's happening in this Narmasach, like the overarching theme is balance, is delicate, is this ability to balance these two poles. On the one hand, we need to help, we have certain restrictions, preventions in order to ensure we don't get in the way of biblical stuff. At the same time, we sometimes have a lot of built-in allowances to ensure that we are able to do things, right? So the whole time of Sefta is going to be this balancing act. Okay, let's jump into the Gemara. Says the Gemara makes a contrast, because over here, we have machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim about something higher than 20 amos and lowering it. Okay, so however, in Masechah Sukkah, we have a very similar machlokas. It's not Hasam was taught there in Masechah Sukkah. Sukkah shigavola ma'al me'asr mama. If you have a sukkah which the schach is higher than 20 amos, okay, sukkah shigavola ma'al me'asr mama, psula, the chacham say it is invalid, pasul. Rabbi Yehuda says it is okay. So Gemara asks, Ma'ishna gabi sukkah tani psula? Why in Masechah Sukkah does it say the word invalid? V'gabe mavoi tani takanta. And whereas over here in Eruvin, it doesn't say invalid, rather it tells you what to do. It says lower it, right? You see the distinction? In Masechah Sukkah, it says a sukkah that's higher than 20 amos, no good, all right? Whereas over here, it says sukkah that's higher than 20 amos, we could lower, right? It tells you what to do, how to fix it. It could have, right? Why is there not consistency? The way Tosos understands the question of Masechah Sukkah, he says, beautifully, he says that even the word pasul, typically the Chachamim want to avoid. Right? Why? Because it's not a good term. It's not a good term. Who cares? Pasul means invalid. It's not kosher. But the point is, they point to many Gemaras where you find which highlight that the Torah will oftentimes not say tameh, it will say eina tahora, not pure. Right? You see the length the Chachamim go and the Torah goes to not say a negative term. Right? We're pretty, unfortunately, we're very flippant about the words that come out of our mouth. And is the word pasul bad? The answer is yes. We want to try as much as possible to use positive terminology, and therefore what the Gemara is really asking is that the terminology here is great. Because it doesn't say it's invalid, which, again, you and I are not so sensitive, but the point is that is a negative term. That's saying it's no good. Rather tells you how to fix it. Why is the Mishnah in Masech Sukkah doesn't have that same constructive, positive terminology? And that's, again, just a powerful lesson to ourselves. Like, the Gemara is preferring that we go ahead, even though, by the way, there's more words. And you have to keep in mind in the times of the Mishnah, these things are taught orally. They want to typically teach things in a very succinct fashion. But they say it's better to teach in a way that is not succinct, so that we don't say something negative from our mouth. Powerful, okay? So the Gemara says, again, why by sukkah does it say pasul? Over here, we're comfortable even using more terminology, but telling you how to rectify it. So the Gemara says, sukkah d'oraisa tani psula, mavei d'rabanan tani tekanta. The way Tosfos understands the answer is that it's true. It'd be better if we would just say by the sukkah, lower it under 20 amos. The reason we don't do that is because we're dealing with the d'oraisa. We're dealing with a biblical prohibition. In other words, a sukkah that's too high, that's a real problem. It's really problematic, and because it's d'oraisa, and therefore we can't allow ourselves to use lighter terminology. In other words, again, it's about Eruvin. The whole Masechta is going to be about a balancing act, right? And you see that in the opening lines. What's happening over here is, yes, it's true. It's better to speak softly, but sometimes we speak softly, we speak too nuanced, or whatever it is. People don't really get what we're saying, right? D'oraisa, we're not messing around. Bad. Not good, okay? We're not going to be able to say, maybe you should do this, because if you say, lower it, implies, okay, maybe you could lower it, you can lower it, it's a nice suggestion. We're not messing around. It's a d'oraisa, it's a biblical thing. We have to be straight up. We have to be straightforward, and therefore we say it is completely invalid, whereas over here, we're dealing with Eruvin, which are already rabbinic. We're more comfortable with lighter terminology. That's one answer. The truth is, we would be comfortable, even by a biblical law, we would go so far as to use this lighter language, and we would say by the sukkah, lower it under 20 amos. So what's the reason why in sukkah does not do so? If you look in the Mishnah Sukkah, they just list a whole bunch of different invalidations. One of them is higher than 20 amos. One of them is if it's shade if it's more sunlight than shade. It has a whole bunch of different issues. So if it goes through, there's a lot of different things that are being discussed there. And therefore I can't go through each one and say, this is the way to fix this one, this is the way to fix that one, this is the way to fix this one. Instead it just makes it simple. All these cases are invalid, okay? Over here by Mavoi in our Mishnah, we're only talking about two things. Too high, too wide. It's much easier to just say, this is the way to fix it. Okay, so the second answer is focusing more on saying that it's more about the succinct nature of the Mishnayos. We want to ensure, again, keep in mind, they were teaching these Mishnayos, they were memorizing these Mishnayos, and therefore it's better to do it this way. Okay, fine. Now what we're going to get into is what is the background behind the machlokes between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yehuda about the height of the Korah, right? Tanna Kama says it has to be under 20 amos, and Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be. Rabbi Yehuda says it could be even higher than 20 amos. What is the source for this machlokes? So let's see. Rabbi Yehuda, you're going to see a very interesting source. Hopefully, we'll have time at the end just to unpack a little bit because it's such a strange source for our discussion. Okay, let's see. Rabbi Yehuda, the Chachamim learned it from the entranceway of the sanctuary. They're referring to the sanctuary of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, the Beis Hamikdash, just to remind ourselves what the Beis Hamikdash looked like, it was a little different than the Mishkan. The Mishkan was just a straight up rectangle. The Beis Hamikdash had the sanctuary, which is where the menorah was and the mizbeach, all that. And then outside of it, there was an entranceway, kind of like our shul's entranceway, which was larger than the actual space inside. Right? So almost like think about our new entranceway, right? It's that big piece in the front and then smaller behind it. That's exactly what the Beis Hamikdash was. You had a larger, a taller, wider, entranceway in front, and then you had a smaller door beyond it to get into it. Yeah.
Like Shomer also, where you got the big.
Why bring up Shomer? I'm just kidding. It's called. I'm just messing with you. Yeah. 100%.
Also, if you look at the Chabad Yeshiva also, it's huge. It's a big.
Yes. A big thing in front and then a small thing. Exactly. That's exactly what it is. So Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Yeah. The Chacham learns it from the entranceway to the sanctuary, meaning the main place, the place you have the menorah, etc. Rabbi Yehuda learned it from the entranceway of the. I hate that word. There has to be a better word. Like I don't know what's a better word. Like the antechamber is the word they use. But the point is the entrance beyond it. What's the word we would use in real English? Sorry, the foyer. Okay, right. The foyer. The foyer. Excellent. Okay, Ditznan. Okay, it was taught. Pischo shel heichal, the entranceway of the sanctuary. Gavo esrim ama v'rachbo eser amos. The sanctuary was 20 amos high and 10 amos wide. Bishal ulam gavo arbaim ama v'rachbo esrim ama was 40 amos high and 20 amos wide. Okay, what connections they have to our discussion? Okay, so good. So the foyer was 40 amos high. Okay, that fits like to Rabbi Yehuda, who says it could be higher than 20 amos, and the entranceway of the sanctuary was 20 amos high, and that's where the Chum get this idea that the Korah can't be higher than 20. But what does that have to do with our discussion? Ushneim mikra echad darshu. So the Gemara continues and explains that they're both learning it from the same pasuk. Pasuk says v'shachtu Pesach ol moed. You should slaughter the offering in the entranceway, and that's the key word. Pesach at the entranceway of the tabernacle. There's a reference to the Mishkan itself. Okay, the run that they use in the midbar. D'Rabbanan tzarei kedushas heichal echud. The Chachamim hold that the sanctity, the holiness of the sanctuary is distinct, and the holiness of the foyer is distinct. Okay, meaning that whenever, again, there are many laws that are taught in the context of the Mishkan, which was in the Midbar. Okay, and we extrapolate and we apply them to the Beis Hamikdash. Right? Mishkan was what they had when they were in the desert, and then they apply those laws to the Beis Hamikdash. Good? So now the Pasuk said that they slaughter it at the doorway of the Ohel Moed. Now, in the Ohel Moed, in the Midbar, they did not have a foyer. Wasn't that fancy? They just had the square, right? All they had was the sanctuary. And so the Chachamim say that when the Pasuk said that they slaughter it at the entranceway of the tabernacle, the entranceway of the Mishkan, the Pesach Ohel Moed, what that refers to is the Heichal. If you translate that, you extrapolate to the Beis Hamikdash, it refers to the doorway of the sanctuary, not the doorway of the foyer. If something has to be done at the doorway of the Beis Hamikdash, it would refer to, and we're learning it from the Mishkan, we're going to say it has to be done at the doorway of the sanctuary, not of the foyer.
So
okay.
The holier area as opposed to the more.
As the foyer, exactly. And because of that, when the Torah, by referring to the Mishkan, says at the Pesach, the doorway of the Ohel Moed, it therefore is referring to the doorway of the sanctuary. And how large is the doorway of the sanctuary? 20 amos high. And so you see the word Pesach, which is what we're really getting at. What we're getting at is that when we have a doorway at Shelleydale, at a mavoi, at the end of a mavoi, then it's seen as distinct, right? A doorway basically creates a separate entity, a separate, distinction between one place and another. So the pasuk says Pesach, a doorway, and that's a reference to, based on the Chacham's learning, it's a reference to the doorway of the sanctuary of the Ulam, and that is 20 amos high. So you see, a doorway will be the limit. You'll see a doorway in the Torah is always going to be a height of 20 amos high, maximum. And therefore, when we think of a source for how big is a doorway, at what point is a doorway no longer a doorway? The answer is 20 amos high, based on their learning. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Savar. When is the door not a door? Exactly. Both the door, both the sanctuary and the foyer, it's one sanctity. And therefore, when it says by the Mishkan, the entranceway of the Mishkan, it's foreshadowing. It's also talking about not only the sanctuary but also the foyer, which we know is higher than 20 amos. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda would say a doorway is even higher than 20 amos, and that's the source of the machlokas. Okay, that's one way of learning it. He agrees that the foyer is distinct from the sanctuary. Okay, so really that can't be a source. Because there is a pasuk that says to the entranceway of the ulam habayis, to the antechamber, to the foyer of the house. Right, so it's used the word Pesach, use the word doorway in the context of the foyer. There's a more explicit source where it says the doorway of the foyer. The Rabbanan counter that and says el Pesach ulam. If it would say to the entranceway, the Pesach, the doorway of the foyer kidkamras, then that makes sense. El Pesach ulam habayis. The fact that it says the entranceway of the foyer of the house. Habayis hapasuach la'ulam. What the pasuk means is that there is the house, i.e., the sanctuary, that is open to the foyer. In other words, the pasuk, if it would just have a standalone pasuk and say the doorway of the foyer, great, but it doesn't say that. It says the doorway of the foyer to the house. So the Chamri, the pasuk is saying the doorway is really a reference to the doorway from the inner doorway, not the outer doorway. It refers to the doorway from the sanctuary that leads into the foyer. That's the lower one. That's the 20 amos high, right? So there is no pasuk, there is no source which speaks about a doorway which is leading into the foyer itself. Bottom line is, that is the machlokas. They're both learning it from the Mishkan /Mikdash. Okay, the Gemara asks, "Vaki ksiv hi, the Mishkan ksiv." What's going on over here? The pasuk this whole Pesach pasuk, the pasuk that refers to a doorway, is not said in the context of a Beis Hamikdash. It's said in the context of the Mishkan. So the Gemara says, no, that's not a problem. Ashkan Mishkan Dikrei Mikdash. We find in places that the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is called temple. Okay, Mikdash Dikrei Mishkan, and we find places where the temple is sometimes called the tabernacle. In other words, the terms are interchangeable. It's true. in the Torah, it's referring to the Mishkan, but the truth is Mishkan also means Beis HaMikdash. And therefore when it says Al Pesach O Al Moed, it's not limited to the Mishkan, it also refers to the Beis HaMikdash, and whatever measurements are going to be true there are going to be true here as well. Dilo Temehach, if you don't say this, if you don't agree with this, Hada Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, we have a teaching from Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Shlamim Sheshchatan Kodem Psichas Lasas Heichal Psulin, that if a peace offering, a shlamim, is slaughtered before the doors of the Beis HaMikdash were opened, as a way of saying the day has started, right? In order to indicate that the day of service has started, they would open the doors, and now things start. If let's say someone was Yad HaKohen who was antsy, okay, and he went ahead and he slaughtered the thing early, before they opened the doors, right? The Kohanim were known to be like intense people, right? And basically they would go ahead, and let's say they start early. If they start early, it's invalid. What's the source? That's Shchato Pesach Ol Moed. It has to be slaughtered at the doorway of the Ol Moed. Bizman Psuchen, the Chum learn, doesn't just mean literally at the doorway, it means from the word Pesach, meaning it has to be opened. V'lo bizman she'en ne'ulin, and not when they're closed. But Shmuel is referring to a law in the Beis HaMikdash. He's not referring to something that took place in the desert. He's referring to a law in the Beis HaMikdash. V'aki ksiv hahi. But that pasuk, when is that pasuk written? But Mishkan ksiv, it's written in the context of the Mishkan. Ella, what do you have to say? Ashkan mikdash dikra mishkan. It must be that even though sometimes, things are said called a mishkan, but really, it's sometimes the Beis HaMikdash itself is called a mishkan. Mishkan dikra mikdash, and sometimes you'll have the mishkan, which is referred to as a Beis HaMikdash. In other words, the two are interchangeable. And it's not going to be, it's not a problem. Okay? Fine. The Gemara says, Bishlam mikdash dikra mish, and therefore the Gemara says that Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, this halacha is relevant to the Beis HaMikdash because he understands that the two terms are interchangeable, and there's no issue. Bishlam, and the Gemara just wants to bring a source. This Bishlam and Mikdash Dikri Mishkan. I see a place where the Beis HaMikdash referred to as a Mishkan Dechsiv V'nasatis Mishkani B'sochechem. That after the Mishkan was already built, God says, "I will place my Mishkan among you." Now the Mishkan was already built. So what is God referring to when He says, "I'm going to give you a Mishkan"? It refers to the future Beis HaMikdash. So you see, even though God used the word Mishkan, it refers to a Beis HaMikdash. Fine.
It's written as a future.
It's written as a future thing, exactly. Ela Mishkan Dikra Mikdash Minalan. Where do you see that the Mishkan is called a Beis HaMikdash? If you want to say it's in the context of the Kahasim, the family of Kahas, which it says they would carry the Mikdash. And maybe that's a reference to the Mishkan, which they were carrying. They were carrying the things from the Mishkan. So you see that they refer to the Mishkan as Mikdash. The Gemara says we're on Beis Beis now. Hahuba Aron Siv. That is a reference to the Aron, the Ark, right? And maybe it's not a reference to the Mishkan or Mikdash at all. So that's not a good source. Elamehacha, rather from where? V'asli mikdash v'shachati b'socham. When God introduces the whole concept of a Beis HaMikdash, of the Mishkan, He refers to it as a mikdash. The point is, you see those terms mikdash, mishkan, mikdash, they're interchangeable, and therefore, again, to conclude, both Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan are both learning this concept of this notion of going. Again, what's the issue over here? There's a rabbinic decree that I'm afraid I'm going to be carrying something on Shellydale, and I'm not going to realize that Shellydale and Greenspring are different. Greenspring's Rosh Hashanah in this context, so maybe I'm going to go ahead and carry from Shellydale onto Greenspring, and that would be in violation of biblical prohibition. The rabbi said, no problem, make it into a doorway. How do you make it in a doorway? Put a beam, a cross beam, atop. Oh, this is a distinct place. I'm not going to treat it the same way. I'm going to put my thing down. We need to have reminders in life. We need to have different things that keep us on track, right? That's the point over here. And what's the source for this? The source for this is the Beis HaMikdash, which is the pasuk that is the context of the Mishkan. But the point is Mishkan and Mikdash interchangeable, and therefore there's no problem. What's I think beautiful about this is that we're talking about a doorway of the Beis HaMikdash. What relevance does that have to Shellydale? The point is that at least in our worldview, in Jewish worldview, there is no real distinction. In other words, we find over and over again. We find that Hanukkah, right? The whole notion of lighting a menorah in our house is basically making a statement saying our house is a mikdash or a mishkan, whichever term you want to use. But the point is that the Torah sees those as interchangeable. It's not like this bifurcation of like we're holy over here, we're not holy in our house. No, the point is that the Torah doesn't say, no one stops and says, wait a second, that's referring to the Beis HaMikdash Pesach, not a regular street Pesach. The point is that in the Torah, the Gemara assumes as a given that the two are interchangeable, that we don't distinguish between what's called a quote-unquote holy place and a mundane place. The whole purpose of us, again, lighting menorah, putting the Korah, is to say that we see them as absolutely the same, and we are expected to elevate, not just to elevate in a Beis HaMikdash, in a shul, or whatever it is, in a Beis Medrash, but to go ahead and elevate in a home as well. Have a wonderful day. Happy Hanukkah.